The thing we have come to call the Bayeux Tapestry is not, strictly speaking, a tapestry at all. A tapestry is woven, the picture forming as the threads cross. This is an embroidery. The picture is added afterwards, in colored wools, onto a foundation of plain linen. It is also extraordinary in its scale. The cloth is roughly 70 meters long. That is more than 230 feet, longer than a modern football pitch, stitched along a strip only about half a meter tall. Along that strip, in 58 numbered scenes, runs a single continuous story, the events leading to the Norman conquest of England, the invasion itself, and the battle, on a Sussex ridge, that decided who would wear the English crown. It is one of the most detailed pictures we possess of the 11th century. And almost everything about it is, in some quiet way, contested. But before we walk along the frieze, we should walk into the story it tells. In the first week of January, in the year 1066, an old king lies dying in a new stone palace beside the River Thames. His name is Edward, called the Confessor. He has ruled England for almost a quarter of a century, and he has no son. Around his bed gather the great men of the kingdom. Chief among them is Harold Godwin's son, Earl of Wessex, a powerful magnate, brother of the Queen. According to the English sources, the dying king extends his hand to Harold and commends the kingdom to his protection. Within a day of Edward's death, Harold is acclaimed king and crowned in the new abbey at Westminster. Across the Channel, in Normandy, a duke called William takes a different view. He claims that Edward, years earlier, had promised the crown to him. He claims further that Harold himself, on a visit to Normandy, had sworn an oath on holy relics to support that claim. To William, Harold is not a king. He is a perjurer. But the tapestry tells the story slightly wrong, or at least, slightly its own way. The frieze shows Harold's coronation. It shows him enthroned, holding orb and scepter, the very image of a lawful king. But beside that scene, the embroiderers have stitched something else, the strange, long-tailed star, blazing across the upper margin of the cloth, and beneath it a knot of courtiers, pointing upwards, their faces stiff with alarm. This is Halley's comet, which crossed the European skies in late April of 1066 and was seen, almost universally, as a portent of disaster. In the chronicles, men spoke of it as a sign that the kingdom was about to change hands. On the tapestry, the comet hangs over Harold's throne like a slow, woolen verdict. A few stitches further along, an empty ghost ship floats in the lower border, its prow turned towards England. The embroiderers, in their quiet way, have already announced who is coming. What the tapestry does not show is just as telling. For most of 1066, William of Normandy gathers a fleet. The tapestry shows the trees being felled, the keels being shaped, the ships being dragged down to the water. It shows wine and grain and chainmail being loaded. It shows horses, of all things, being led up gangplanks into open longships, which was almost unheard of in northern European warfare, and which gave William's army its decisive weapon. The fleet crosses on the night of the 28th of September. It lands, unopposed, at Pevensey on the Sussex coast. Harold, meanwhile, has just fought another battle. Only days earlier, far to the north, he has met and destroyed a Norwegian army at Stamford Bridge. His own brother lies among the dead. When the news of the Norman landing reaches him, he is in York, 250 miles from the coast. He turns his weary army around and marches south. On the morning of the 14th of October, the two armies meet on a low ridge near a place the Normans will come to call Senlac, the Lake of Blood. The battle lasts most of a day. The tapestry gives almost a quarter of its entire length to it. We see the Norman cavalry climbing the hill again and again. We see the English standing in their shield wall on the crest, axes raised. We see fallen men in the lower border, stripped of their armor by looters as the fighting goes on above them. And then, near the end, we see the death of Harold. A figure stands beneath the embroidered inscription Harold Rex Interfectus Ist, King Harold has been killed. He clutches at an arrow lodged in or near his eye. He falls beneath the hooves of a Norman horseman. Whether the arrow is historical, or whether it is simply the way the embroiderers chose to mark his death, has been argued for 200 years. Some scholars now think the falling figure beneath the hooves is the true Harold, and the arrow figure is another English captain. The cloth does not entirely settle its own story. What we know is that, on that evening, the throne of England changed. Where, then, did the cloth come from? The most widely accepted answer is that it was commissioned by William's half-brother, Odo, Bishop of Bayeux. Odo is one of the few named figures who appears prominently in the tapestry without obvious reason. He is shown rallying the Norman knights at the height of the battle, a baton in his hand, animatedly inspiring the young men. It reads, gently, like the kind of compliment a man pays himself. The stitching itself, however, is almost certainly English. The Latin inscriptions use forms favored in Canterbury. The drawing style echoes manuscripts produced in the Great Canterbury Scriptoria. The wool is dyed with English plants. The needlework follows English convention. The most likely story, then, is this: a Norman bishop, brother of the new king, commissioned a great cloth to celebrate his family's victory, and had it made, in his newly conquered land, by the very women whose menfolk had lost the battle. It was probably hung, once a year, around the nave of Bayeux Cathedral on the Feast of Relics. For most of the year it lay in its chest, in the dark, untouched. That dark chest is what saved it. For 7 centuries, the tapestry survives by being mostly forgotten. It is mentioned, once, in an inventory of the cathedral in the year 1476. It is rediscovered, more or less by accident, by an antiquarian in the early 18th century, who writes the first scholarly description. And then, in the autumn of 1792, the French Revolution nearly destroys it. A revolutionary battalion, leaving Bayeux to fight on the Rhine frontier, finds itself short of canvas to cover its supply wagons. Someone remembers the long, heavy strip of linen in the cathedral. The mob is at the door. The cloth is taken down. It is about to be cut up and thrown over a wagon. A Bayeux lawyer named Lambert Leonard Leforestier intervenes. He argues, urgently, that the cloth is of historical interest to the new republic, that it shows the great deeds of the French nation. The argument works. The tapestry is rolled up again. It is sent to the town hall for safekeeping. But the cloth itself nearly burned. A decade later, in 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte requisitions it. He has it shipped to Paris and put on public display. He is planning an invasion of England, and the parallel is too useful to ignore. A French duke, crossing the Channel, defeating an English king on his own soil, it is good propaganda. The invasion never happens. Napoleon's fleet is destroyed at Trafalgar. The tapestry, in due course, is sent back to Bayeux. It survives the 19th century in a long glass case under reading lamps. It survives the First World War in a fortified cellar. And then, in the summer of 1944, it nearly disappears again. During the German occupation of France, the cloth is moved several times for its protection. It is studied, with peculiar interest, by a research division of the SS called the Ahnenerbe, whose task is to gather evidence for the supposed Germanic origins of European civilization. The Normans, descendants of Norse settlers in northern France, are of intense interest to them. The cloth is, in their reading, a Germanic victory monument. In August of 1944, as the Allies close on Paris, an order is sent from Berlin. The tapestry is to be moved east, into German hands. 2 SS officers are dispatched to the Louvre, where the cloth has been stored. They arrive a day after the city has risen against the German garrison. They cannot reach the building. The tapestry stays in Paris. By the end of the month it is back in French custody. By the autumn it is once more on its way home to Bayeux. It had been, by then, almost 900 years old. You can walk along it today, in a quiet curved gallery in the town of Bayeux, in Normandy. The lights are kept low. Visitors are asked to speak in whispers. The cloth runs along one wall, in its long glass case, and you follow it scene by scene, from the old king on his deathbed, through the comet and the ships and the battle, to the unfinished edge at the far end, where some of the original final scenes are now lost. It is a strange thing to stand before. Almost 1,000 years old. Stitched, most likely, by the patient hands of English women in a Canterbury workshop, telling, in coloured wool, the story of how their own country was taken. Saved by a small-town lawyer with the courage to face a revolutionary mob. Saved again by the slow rhythm of an uprising in Paris. There are histories written in ink, and there are histories written in stone. This one is written in wool. It has outlived the kingdom it celebrates, and the kingdom it mourns, and several attempts to put it to other uses. It is still here. It is still telling the same story. If this drift along 70 meters of stitched linen has quieted your mind tonight, there are more old things sewn into time waiting for us, more cloths, more cathedrals, more ruins to walk together in the dark. Subscribe, and we will meet again at the next one. Sleep well.